The alarm screamed through the vault at the worst possible moment, and I nearly dropped the data crystal that held 40 years of stolen truth. My 4 hands moved on pure reflex. 2 pressed the crystal against the concealed slot beneath my coat, while the other 2 swept across the terminal, wiping my access trail in 3 practiced keystrokes. The vault door was sealed from the inside, a precaution I always took during these midnight operations. If the alarm was for me, I had roughly 90 seconds before Cathara security forces would breach it with thermal charges. I had survived close calls before, 7 in the past decade alone, but never with this much classified material pressed against my ribs, so close I could feel the data humming through the crystal's casing, like a second heartbeat pulsing out of rhythm with my own. I counted to 10. No breach charge detonated against the door. No containment gas hissed through the ventilation shafts. No heavy reptilian footsteps thundered down the corridor outside. The alarm shifted pitch, cycling from the sharp crimson pulse of a security breach to the slower amber rotation of a general alert. Not a vault alarm, a station-wide notification. Something had happened elsewhere, something large enough to trigger every alert system on the station simultaneously, but it had nothing to do with me. I allowed myself one breath. My upper right hand was still trembling. The lower 2 were steady because they always were. Because those were the hands I used for delicate archival work, and I had trained them over 4 decades to remain calm, regardless of what the rest of my body was doing. I accessed the nearest public information terminal with my lower left hand, while my upper right maintained gentle pressure on the crystal beneath my coat. The notification was a first contact flag. Somewhere at the edge of the galaxy, far beyond the outermost Cascade corridor, an unknown species had broadcast an open signal on every frequency simultaneously. They identified themselves as humans, from a planet called Earth, in a star system that had never appeared in any catalog, survey, or monitoring report in the 4,000-year history of the Cathara Ascendancy. The border monitoring array had picked up the signal 14 hours ago and was now distributing the preliminary threat assessment to all administrative personnel station-wide. I read the assessment twice. Single star system, 1 inhabited planet, no Cascade corridor access, no faster-than-light capability of their own. Estimated technological classification, emergent pre-galactic. Military capacity, negligible. Strategic value, none. The assessment's final line was a recommendation I had seen stamped across the bottom of hundreds of similar first contact files across my 40 years in the Cathara archives. Subjugation treaty recommended. Standard terms. No strategic significance. I almost laughed, and I never laugh inside the vault, because sound carries through the walls, and a laughing archivist at midnight is exactly the sort of anomaly that Cathara security officers love to investigate. I suppressed it, and felt the bitterness settle in my chest like a familiar poison. I had been stealing records from the Cathara Ascendancy for 4 decades. I had documented every atrocity their empire had committed across 4,000 years of galactic rule, copied every suppressed history and classified execution order and erased census record onto contraband data crystals that I hid in the walls of my quarters behind false panels I had installed myself. I had watched the Cathara erase civilizations from the historical record as casually as wiping condensation from a viewport. I had cataloged the names of the dead from 211 failed uprisings, each one more hopeless than the last, each one crushed so thoroughly that within a generation, nobody remembered it had ever happened at all. And here was another species about to walk into the same trap, completely unaware, sending their cheerful little signal out into the dark, not knowing that the galaxy they were so eager to join was a prison controlled by reptilian overlords who had monopolized the only means of interstellar travel for longer than most species in the galaxy had possessed written language. The Cascade corridors. That was the foundation of everything the Cathara had built. Naturally occurring gravitational tunnels threaded through the fabric of space, the only reliable method of faster-than-light transit between star systems. You could travel at sublight speeds without them, certainly, but the distances between stars were measured in decades and centuries at sublight, which made the corridors the only practical method of interstellar civilization. There were 1,412 of them mapped throughout the galaxy, forming a complex web of transit routes that connected every inhabited system, and the Cathara controlled every single one. If you wanted to trade, You paid the Cathara a transit tariff on every shipment. If you wanted to travel between systems, you submitted to Cathara inspection at both ends of the corridor. If you wanted to communicate across interstellar distances, using the relay networks built into the corridor infrastructure, you accepted Cathara monitoring of every transmission. And if you objected to any of this, the Cathara could simply close the corridors around your home system, cutting you off from the rest of the galaxy entirely. No trade, no communication, no travel, total isolation. I had documented what happened to species that objected. The records filled 17 data crystals in the deepest hidden compartment in my quarters. The Sorvathi had objected 18 years ago. They had organized a military uprising coordinated across 12 systems, the largest organized rebellion in over 1,000 years, involving 9 separate species and a combined fleet of 800 warships. The Cathara response took less than a single day. They activated the failsafe network, a hidden system of automated weapons platforms positioned near every major corridor, and collapsed the gravitational tunnels surrounding the Sorvathi home system. The corridors did not merely close. They were destroyed. The gravitational architecture that sustained them shattered beyond repair. 9 billion Sorvathi were sealed inside their own solar system, like insects preserved in amber. No trade, no communication, no visitors, no escape. 18 years later, nobody in the wider galaxy knew if they were even still alive. The Cathara had erased them from every official record, and I was the only person I knew of who had preserved the truth on contraband crystals hidden behind a false wall panel in an archivist's quarters. 211 rebellions in 4,000 years. Every single one crushed. I kept the count because someone had to. Because the Cathara rewrote history after each failed uprising to make it seem as though resistance had never existed at all, as though every species in the galaxy had always been content under Cathara rule, as though the very concept of rebellion was a fiction invented by malcontents and criminals. My name is Raylan So. I am a Valesi, one of the four-armed species that submitted to the Cathara peacefully 3,000 years ago, in exchange for being allowed to serve in their bureaucracy. We are archivists, clerks, administrators, record keepers. We are very good at being invisible, at fading into the background of any room, at becoming so synonymous with the machinery of bureaucracy that people forget we are living beings with thoughts and loyalties and the capacity for treason. That invisibility is why I have survived 40 years of stealing classified records from the most powerful military empire in the galaxy without being detected. Not because I am brave, because I am furniture. I sealed the vault, secured the data crystal in my coat, and made my way back to my quarters through corridors that hummed with the low ambient noise of Cathara station operations. On the way, I passed a junction where 2 Cathara officers stood, talking in the relaxed posture of predators, discussing something too small to constitute prey. "Humans," one of them said, his scaled crest flattened against his skull in an expression of boredom so profound it bordered on contempt. "Single-planet species, pre-galactic. They will sign the subjugation treaty within a standard cycle, probably less." "Has the High Sovereign been briefed?" the other asked, her claws clicking absently against the corridor wall. The first officer's crest rippled with amusement. Drekthar sent a junior attaché to handle the first contact assessment. He did not consider it worth his personal attention. His exact words were that he had more important things to attend to than every backwater species that learned how to shout into the dark. I walked past them without adjusting my pace or my breathing. Valesi do not attract attention. That is our gift and our curse. In my quarters, I locked the door, extracted the crystal, and began integrating its contents into my hidden archive, a process that required all 4 hands working simultaneously across 2 separate terminal interfaces, while my eyes monitored the corridor surveillance feed I had tapped into 6 years ago to ensure nobody was approaching my door. As I worked, I pulled up the human's original first contact broadcast on a secondary display and read the full text for a 3rd time. Something about it nagged at me, a quality so subtle that no intelligence analyst would waste time flagging it. But 40 years of reading between the lines of Cathara propaganda had given me a sensitivity to the weight and shape of specific word choices that bordered on obsession. The human's broadcast was not a plea. It was not the tentative, eager, slightly desperate signal that newly discovered species typically transmitted, the galactic equivalent of a child calling out in a dark room, hoping someone friendly would answer. It was not a request for trade, or diplomatic recognition, or technological exchange. It was not the formal, cautious overture of a civilization that had just discovered it was not alone in the universe, and was appropriately nervous about what that might mean. It was an invitation. The humans had invited the galaxy to visit Earth, not asked permission to join galactic civilization, not requested an audience with whatever species held authority, not submitted a petition for consideration by the Cathara Ascendancy or any other governing body. They had opened their door and told the entire galaxy to come to them, as though they were the ones extending a favor, as though they were welcoming guests into their home, rather than begging entrance into someone else's. It was a small thing, a tonal detail that could easily be attributed to cultural difference or translation artifact. But I had spent 4 decades reading the communications of subjugated species, and I knew what submission sounded like. This did not sound like submission. I filed it away. I logged the first contact event in my secret archive under the classification tag I used for incidents, with no bearing on the broader struggle against the Cathara, no strategic consequence. I would later scratch out those words with such force that my stylus tore through 3 layers of the display surface. 6 months after first contact, I still could not explain why the humans unsettled me. On paper, they were the least threatening species to enter the galactic community in living memory. They had signed the Cathara's subjugation treaty without negotiation, the first species in recorded history to accept standard terms without a single counter-demand. Not one objection, not one request for modification, not even the token, largely symbolic resistance that most species managed as a matter of cultural pride before capitulating to the inevitable. I had read 312 subjugation treaties in my career. Every species pushes back. It is a universal constant of sentient behavior, as reliable as gravitational attraction or the tendency of bureaucracies to expand. The Vithlesi, my own people, had negotiated for 6 months before signing, and we are the most conflict-averse species in the known galaxy. The Sorvathi had demanded 47 separate amendments. The Grelathi, barely spacefaring amphibians with no military capacity whatsoever, had still insisted on a reduced tribute rate for their primary export commodity. Every species, no matter how small, no matter how overmatched, found something to push back on. Some dignity to preserve, some line to draw, even if the line was meaningless. The humans drew no lines. They agreed to everything. They signed the same day the treaty was presented, with an efficiency that the Cathara diplomatic corps found amusing and that I found deeply, inexplicably wrong. In my experience, there are only 2 categories of people who accept terrible terms without resistance. The first are those too broken or too ignorant to understand what they are surrendering. The second are those who have already decided that the terms do not matter because they have no intention of honoring them. I had seen 312 examples of the first category. I had never encountered the second. But something in the absolute, frictionless compliance of the human response felt less like submission and more like a door being held open for a reason I could not see. I filed the observation in my secret archive and moved on. I had more immediate concerns. My resistance contacts in the outer sectors were going dark, not captured, just exhausted. After the Sorvathi failure 18 years ago, the morale of every dissident network in the galaxy had collapsed like a structure losing its last load-bearing wall. The general who coordinated the remnants of organized resistance, a Dranathi veteran named Kellen Vosk, had told me during our most recent encrypted exchange that the fight was over. Not lost exactly, just over. The fire had gone out, and nobody had the energy to relight it. So I did what I had always done. I archived. I documented. I bore witness to a galaxy that had surrendered. And I told myself that the act of recording the truth was sufficient justification for continuing to risk my life, even if nobody ever read a single word I had written. The archivist's consolation prize, futility dressed up as purpose. Then the humans started arriving. Not in fleets, not in diplomatic delegations, not in any configuration that would trigger a security review or attract the attention of Cathara intelligence analysts. They came individually, or in small groups of 2 or 3, applying for the most unremarkable positions available across Cathara-controlled space. Maintenance engineers, communications relay technicians, freight logistics coordinators, sanitation system specialists, data infrastructure consultants, power grid calibration assistants. The kind of jobs that kept the vast machinery of the Ascendancy functioning, but carried no authority, no prestige, no access to classified systems, and most importantly, no scrutiny. They were unfailingly polite, remarkably competent, and completely forgettable. Within 3 months, you could find humans working in freight depots, relay stations, power substations, and corridor maintenance bays across dozens of systems, and nobody thought twice about it, because nobody ever thinks twice about the people who fix the plumbing. I met my first human in person on a morning when the climate control system in the archive wing failed for the 3rd time in a single month. The maintenance request I had filed was answered by a man named Davi Cortez, who arrived with a toolkit slung over one shoulder and a smile that seemed almost aggressively out of place on a Cathara military station. He was smaller than I expected. Humans are small by galactic standards, shorter than most spacefaring species, with only 2 arms and a soft, unarmored exterior that looked almost fragile compared to the scaled hides, chitinous plates, and reinforced skeletal structures common among other civilizations. Davy had brown skin, dark eyes, and the kind of unhurried calm that suggested either deep, unshakable confidence or the total obliviousness of someone who did not understand how much danger they were in. I could not tell which. He fixed the climate unit in under an hour. 3 separate Cathara maintenance teams had failed to repair it permanently across 3 separate service calls over the past month. Davy diagnosed the root cause in 12 minutes, replaced a component that the Cathara technicians had not even identified as relevant, and had the system running at optimal specifications before the end of his first hour on site. While he worked, he talked. Not about himself, which I found notable, about me. He asked what I did in the archives, what kind of records I maintained, how the filing systems were organized, what classification hierarchies the Cathara used to categorize different levels of restricted information. His questions were friendly, conversational, the kind of casual professional curiosity that a competent technician might naturally express when working in an unfamiliar department. But they were also precise, specific. He was not making small talk. He was building a map. I found myself answering more openly than I should have. There was something about the way he listened, a quality of genuine attention that made me feel, against all evidence and professional judgment, that the information I was sharing was safe with him. I told him about the archive's classification tiers, about the restricted vault system, about the bureaucratic channels through which the Cathara tracked dissident communications and flagged subversive content for review. I stopped short of revealing my own role in the resistance, my 4 decades of theft and treason, but I gave him the structural overview of the system, the architecture of control. He thanked me, finished the repair, packed his tools, and left. The climate unit worked flawlessly from that day forward. Over the following months, I encountered humans with increasing frequency, across every sector I had administrative access to. A human communications specialist on Relay Station Verath, a human logistics coordinator at the primary freight hub on Koros, a pair of human data technicians at the administrative center on Dren 4, maintaining the information processing systems that routed bureaucratic traffic across 3 sectors. A human sanitation engineer on a mining platform so remote that Cathara officers considered assignment there to be a form of punishment. A human power grid calibration assistant on a corridor maintenance vessel that serviced the transit tunnels in the outer spiral arm. They were everywhere, and they were nowhere. Present in the system, but absent from anyone's attention, performing their jobs with quiet excellence and attracting exactly 0 interest from the Cathara security apparatus, which was laser-focused on identifying political threats, military buildups, and diplomatic conspiracies, not on monitoring the employment records of maintenance workers. I am an archivist. Patterns are what I do. When most people look at data, they see individual points. When I look at data, I see the shape that the points form when you connect them. And the shape that was forming across my data screens was unlike anything I had seen in 40 years of studying the internal workings of the Cathara Ascendancy. I began tracking human personnel placements methodically, cross-referencing them with infrastructure maps, corridor locations, communication network topology diagrams, and military deployment schedules. The work consumed my evenings for 3 weeks. I had to be extraordinarily careful, pulling data from different administrative systems on different days, through different access terminals, to avoid creating a searchable pattern in the audit logs. I masked each query behind legitimate archival maintenance tasks, requesting personnel registries under the pretext of updating historical employment records, pulling infrastructure maps under the cover of verifying reference material for a classification review. The picture that emerged when I assembled the data made my blood go cold in all 4 of my circulatory pathways simultaneously. In 6 months, humans had placed at least one operative within operational proximity of every single cascade corridor in the galaxy. All 1,412 of them. Not at the corridors themselves, which were heavily monitored by Cathara military personnel, but near them, on maintenance ships that serviced nearby relay stations, at freight depots that supplied corridor garrison crews, in communication hubs that routed data traffic through the corridor network, always within reach, always in positions that gave them access to the infrastructure surrounding each corridor without requiring them to set foot on the corridor itself, always in roles so menial, so unglamorous, so invisible, that no security review in the galaxy would flag them as suspicious. I contacted Vosk through our encrypted channel and laid out the data. He was dismissive in the tired, automatic way of a man who had been disappointed too many times to invest emotional energy and hope. They are janitors, Raylan, pipe fitters and cable runners. Every newly contacted species sends its workers into the galaxy's infrastructure sector because those are the only jobs available to species with no political standing. It means nothing. The distribution is too precise, I insisted. It is not random. It is not clustered around population centers or economic hubs the way natural migration patterns would be. It is distributed uniformly across every corridor in the network. Every single one, General. The statistical probability of that occurring by chance is functionally 0. Vosk was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular flatness of someone who has already decided that the answer does not matter. Even if the humans are planning something, Raylan, they will fail. Everyone fails. 211 rebellions. I helped lead one of them. I watched 8,000 Dranathi soldiers die in 40 minutes. The Cathara cannot be beaten. Not by janitors, not by anyone. Everyone fails, Raylan. I sat in the dark and tried to convince myself he was right. The next morning, I did something I had never done in 40 years of covert intelligence work. I found Davi Cortez in the maintenance bay during his meal break, sitting alone on a storage crate with a container of food I did not recognize. I sat down across from him without invitation. He looked up with that same disarming smile, as though a 4-armed alien archivist appearing uninvited to share his meal was the most natural occurrence imaginable. "Your people seem to enjoy infrastructure work," I said. He shrugged, a human gesture I had learned to interpret as casual deflection. "We like understanding how things are built." I held his gaze with all the intensity that 40 years of suppressed fury and frustration could produce. Every corridor in the galaxy, every relay station, every communication hub, every freight depot that services corridor operations. Your people are in all of them, every single one. His smile did not falter, but something behind it shifted, a hardening, a door closing behind the friendliness, revealing something older and more deliberate underneath. "We are thorough." "That is not thoroughness," I said. "That is architecture. That is a grid. That is the deployment pattern of an operation so large that it spans the entire galaxy, and you have hidden it inside maintenance uniforms and sanitation contracts." Davi set down his food. The ease drained from his expression completely, and what replaced it was something I had never seen on a human face before. It was the look of someone who has been carrying a weight so enormous that they have stopped noticing it, and who has just been reminded of how heavy it is by someone who can see it. "We like understanding how things are built," he said again. Then he paused. The pause lasted 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds I watched him make a decision that I suspect had been rehearsed and contingency planned and debated across 6 months of operational preparation. And how they come apart. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my hidden terminal and ran the most dangerous data query of my career, cross-referencing the human personnel placements with the classified locations of the Cathara failsafe network. The failsafe locations were the most closely guarded military secret in the galaxy. I had spent 11 years piecing together their positions from fragments scattered across thousands of classified files. A maintenance requisition here, a supply transport manifest there, a personnel rotation order listing coordinates that matched no known station or installation. When I overlaid the human placement map onto the failsafe location map, my hands went numb. Every human operative was positioned within operational range of a failsafe node, every single one, matched with a precision that left no room for coincidence. The humans had mapped the most secret weapons system in the galaxy, and they had placed their people in a perfect grid around it. I sat in the dark of my quarters, staring at the map, and I felt something I had not felt in decades. Not hope, something more dangerous than hope, vertigo. The sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that the ground beneath you is about to move. I closed the map, encrypted my files, and waited for dawn. Everything was about to change. I just did not know when. 17 days later, I woke to silence, and that was how I knew. Every morning for 40 years, I had woken to the ambient hum of Cathara communications traffic flowing through the station's relay systems, a constant low-frequency vibration that was so deeply woven into the rhythm of station life that you stopped hearing it consciously after your first week aboard. It was always there, the electronic pulse of an empire's nervous system, routing military orders and trade manifests and surveillance data and diplomatic dispatches across the galaxy in an endless stream. You noticed it the way you notice your own heartbeat, only when it stops. It stopped. The silence hit me before my eyes were fully open. I lay in my bunk for 2 seconds, feeling the absence of the hum like a missing tooth, and then I was on my feet and dressed in the four-armed blur of motion that Velesi are capable of when our survival instincts override our cultural preference for measured, deliberate movement. I reached for my personal terminal. The screen was active but showing an error I had never seen in 4 decades of working with Cathara systems. Primary authorization protocol not found. Secondary authorization protocol not found. Tertiary authorization protocol not found. Every layer of the Cathara command architecture had been stripped out simultaneously. I ran, through corridors that were already erupting into chaos, past Cathara officers sprinting in full combat armor toward duty stations that I suspected would not respond to their commands when they arrived, past administrative staff clustered around public terminals that all displayed the same cascading authorization failure. I heard fragments of shouted reports as I moved, individual words that meant nothing in isolation, and everything assembled together. Corridors, override, fleet, failsafe, not responding, none of them, nothing. I reached the archive level in under 3 minutes, a sprint that left my secondary respiratory system burning. The archive was abandoned. Every archivist on the station had been pulled to emergency coordination stations, which meant I was alone with 4,000 years of records, and the one diagnostic terminal I had modified 6 years ago to bypass standard access controls. I routed around the dead authorization protocols in 90 seconds and pulled a live feed from the station's external sensor array. The data that filled my screen made me grip the edges of the console with all 4 hands to keep myself upright. Every cascade corridor within sensor range was active, pulsing with energy signatures I had never seen before. The standard Cathara transit protocols, the authorization handshakes, and surveillance monitoring and tribute calculation subroutines that controlled every aspect of corridor transit had been completely replaced. In their place was something clean, simple, and open. An operating protocol that granted unrestricted transit access to any vessel of any species without authorization codes, without tribute payment, without surveillance monitoring, without any form of Cathara control whatsoever. I switched to the communications band. A single message was broadcasting on every frequency in the electromagnetic spectrum, in 600 languages simultaneously, from every relay station in the corridor network. I understood 3 of those languages, and in all 3 the message said exactly the same thing. The corridors are free. Effective immediately. No species requires Cathara authorization for transit. This is not a request. The message was broadcasting from the relay stations, the ones staffed by human maintenance technicians, the ones nobody had paid any attention to because they were staffed by janitors. I left the archive and made for the Sovereign's war chamber 4 levels above, using the maintenance corridors on Deck 7 that I had mapped during my years of covert operations. These passages were unmonitored, designed for utility access rather than personnel movement, and they allowed me to bypass the main corridors where Cathara military personnel were establishing security checkpoints that no longer had any functional authority behind them. I climbed 2 access ladders, crawled through a ventilation junction, and emerged in the observation gallery that overlooked the war chamber through reinforced transparent panels. The scene below me was controlled catastrophe. High Sovereign Drekthar stood at the central command platform, a massive reptilian figure whose physical presence had dominated every room he had ever entered for 4 decades of absolute rule. His ceremonial armor caught the harsh tactical lighting and threw angular reflections across the faces of the 12 senior military officers who surrounded him, each one working a terminal, with the focused desperation of people trying to restart a machine that has been fundamentally altered at the level of its operating code. I could not hear the words through the reinforced glass, but I could read the data feeds on the screens visible from my position in the gallery. The reports came in waves, each one worse than the last. The first wave confirmed what I already knew. Human technicians embedded in corridor relay stations across the galaxy had uploaded a simultaneous software replacement package at Station Dawn. The package had been designed to mimic a standard system update, passing every automated integrity check in the Cathara security architecture. It stripped out every authorization protocol, every access restriction, every tribute calculation module, every surveillance monitoring subroutine, and replaced them with an open access transit protocol that treated every ship from every species as having full, unrestricted clearance. The corridors were fully operational, functioning better than they had in centuries according to the diagnostic data, but they no longer recognized Cathara authority in any form. I watched Drekthar absorb this information. I watched his massive clawed hands grip the edges of the command platform hard enough to gouge visible trenches in the reinforced alloy surface. Then I watched him give the order that I had been dreading since the night I mapped the human placements against the failsafe network. "Activate the failsafes," he said. "Destroy every corridor in the network, all of them, now." The logic was brutal and ancient. If the Cathara could not control the corridors, nobody would have them. Destroy the transit network, trap every species in their home systems, and then rebuild the corridors under Cathara control at whatever pace served Cathara interests. It was the same strategy they had used against the Sorvathi, the Morani, the Drenathi, and dozens of other rebellious species across 4 millennia. The nuclear option, the final argument, the reason no rebellion had ever succeeded. Even if you seized the corridors, the Cathara could simply erase them from existence. The failsafe activation codes went out across the Ascendancy's dedicated military frequency. 214 automated weapons platforms, hidden in asteroids and dead moons and derelict stations across the galaxy, each one capable of generating a targeted gravitational collapse that would permanently destroy the nearest cascade corridor, received the command simultaneously. Nothing happened. I watched the weapons officer check his terminal. I watched him re-enter the activation codes with manual verification. I watched him switch to a backup frequency and transmit the codes again. I watched a second officer take over and attempt a tertiary activation protocol that required 3 separate senior officers to authenticate simultaneously. I watched 3 officers press their authorization tokens to 3 separate scanners in synchronized sequence. Nothing happened. The failsafe weapons platforms were offline. Every single one of the 214 installations had been physically disabled, not destroyed, which would have triggered alarm signatures in the monitoring systems. Disabled. The targeting arrays, the power cores, the gravitational collapse generators, all of the hardware was intact, undamaged, and perfectly maintained. But the critical connection points, The specific components that linked the targeting systems to the firing mechanisms had been surgically disconnected, removed with a precision that spoke of intimate familiarity with the system's engineering, the kind of familiarity you could only develop by spending months performing routine maintenance on nearby installations, and using that access to study the classified hardware that nobody was supposed to know existed. The disconnection timestamps, logged automatically by the platform's internal diagnostics, spanned the previous 6 months. The earliest disconnection had occurred 4 months ago. The most recent had been completed 11 hours before the corridor takeover. 6 months of quiet, patient, invisible work. Human maintenance crews assigned to routine repair jobs on relay stations and freight depots near the hidden fail-safe platforms, using their proximity and their access to nearby infrastructure to locate each platform, study its engineering, and remove the specific components that made it dangerous, leaving the rest of the hardware intact so that the monitoring systems would continue to report normal operational status. They had defused every bomb in the galaxy without anyone noticing that the bombs had been touched. Drekthar did not pause. He did not process. He simply issued the next order in the sequence, because 4,000 years of Cathara military doctrine had prepared contingency upon contingency for exactly this kind of scenario, and the High Sovereign of the Cathara Ascendancy did not panic. He adapted. "Mobilize the war fleet," he said. "All vessels. Every garrison. Seize the corridors by direct force. Lethal authorization against any human personnel encountered." The Cathara war fleet was the most powerful military force in the history of the galaxy. 12,000 warships, ranging from fast-attack corvettes to planet-siege dreadnoughts, carrying weapons capable of sterilizing continental surfaces from orbit. They were stationed across 300 garrison points, each one positioned within rapid transit distance of the nearest Cascade corridor. They had crushed every rebellion in 4,000 years. They had never lost a fleet engagement. They had never needed to, because the mere existence of the fleet was usually sufficient to ensure compliance. When it was not sufficient, the fleet was deployed, and the results were always the same: total, overwhelming, absolute destruction of whatever had been foolish enough to resist. The fleet mobilized. Across 300 garrison points, 12,000 warships powered up their drives, acknowledged deployment orders, and entered the nearest Cascade corridors. I tracked the mobilization on the sensor feeds visible from the observation gallery, watching the icons representing individual warships blink from garrison status to transit status as ship after ship after ship entered the corridor network. Within 90 minutes, over 11,000 warships were in corridor transit, racing through the gravitational tunnels at faster-than-light speeds toward their assigned deployment coordinates across the galaxy. Every single ship exited at the same location, not at their assigned coordinates, not distributed across strategic points throughout the galaxy. Not anywhere near any corridor, any station, any inhabited system. Every warship that entered a Cascade corridor, regardless of its point of entry, regardless of its intended destination, exited at a single set of coordinates. An empty region of deep space, 4,000 light-years from the nearest star system, in a void so remote that the nearest celestial object of any kind was a burned-out brown dwarf 300 light-years away. The modified corridor software had redirected the entire fleet to the most isolated point the humans could calculate, and when the ships arrived, their navigation systems locked. Not damaged, not destroyed, locked. The systems were functional, displaying clean diagnostic readouts and responsive control interfaces, but they would not accept new navigation coordinates. The targeting computers worked, the weapons systems were online and fully operational, the engines had fuel, life support was perfect, communications were active, allowing the fleet to contact each other and, eventually, to contact the stations they had left, confirming that they were alive, unharmed, and completely, absolutely, irreversibly stranded. 12,000 warships, the most powerful military force ever assembled by any civilization in the history of the galaxy, floating in empty void, armed to the teeth, and dangerous to nothing, because there was nothing within weapons range, except other stranded Cathara warships. The armada had been filed in a drawer, and the drawer had been locked. I lowered my datapad and pressed my back against the observation gallery wall, because my legs could no longer support my weight. Through the reinforced panels, I watched the Cathara High Command experience something that no member of their species had experienced in 4,000 years: the complete, simultaneous, irreversible failure of every system they relied upon to maintain power. The corridors were open, the failsafes were dead, the fleet was gone. 3 pillars of 4 millennia of absolute galactic dominion, removed in less than 6 hours by people who had spent the previous 6 months fixing climate control units and recalibrating ventilation sensors. What followed was almost worse to watch than the initial crisis, because what followed was the sound of an empire discovering that it had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. Drekthar began issuing orders for backup systems, secondary communication networks that routed around the corridor relay infrastructure, reserve fleet elements stationed outside corridor range, emergency command protocols established centuries ago for exactly this kind of catastrophic scenario, hidden weapons caches, classified fallback installations. The Cathara had not survived 4,000 years by relying on a single layer of security. They had built redundancy upon redundancy, contingency upon contingency. 4 millennia of accumulated military paranoia crystallized into layer after layer after layer of backup systems, each one designed to activate if the layer above it failed. Every single one was dead. The secondary communication networks had been rerouted through nodes that human technicians had modified weeks ago, turning them into additional broadcast points for the freedom message instead of military command channels. The reserve fleet elements had received falsified stand-down orders through compromised command channels 6 hours before the operation began, transmitted using encryption protocols that the human communications specialists had cracked during their months of routine maintenance on the very systems that generated those protocols. The emergency command protocols required authentication handshakes from failsafe nodes that no longer responded. The classified fallback installations had been located and neutralized using supply chain data that human logistics coordinators had accessed as part of their legitimate freight management duties. I watched a Cathara colonel attempt to activate a tertiary defense grid so deeply classified that I had never found a reference to it in 40 years of searching the archives. The system powered up, queried its authentication network, received no valid responses from any node in the network, and shut itself down with a soft diagnostic chime that sounded almost apologetic. The humans had found it. Whatever it was, however deeply it had been buried in the Cathara's military architecture, the humans had found it, and they had neutralized it with the same quiet, thorough, devastating competence that they had applied to every other system in the Ascendancy. The colonel stared at his terminal for a very long time. Then he sat down. He did not get up again while I was watching. I left the observation gallery. Nobody noticed my departure, just as nobody had noticed my arrival. I descended through the maintenance corridors to Deck 14, where I found Davi Cortez in the main maintenance bay, packing his tools into a standard-issue equipment case, with the careful, unhurried movements of a professional, completing his final shift. He was not celebrating, he was not gloating, he was not armed. He looked tired, in a way that went past exhaustion into something structural, as though the effort of maintaining his cover identity for 6 months, while simultaneously coordinating the most complex covert operation in galactic history, had consumed something inside him that sleep alone would not restore. "How long?" I asked from the doorway. My voice was steady. I was distantly surprised by this. He looked up. 18 months. From the first intercepted Cathara transmission to today. 6 months of signals intelligence and planning, before we ever sent our first contact broadcast. Then 6 months inside the system, mapping and positioning. You knew what the Ascendancy was before you even announced yourselves. We intercepted your communications. We decoded your encryption. We studied your power structure, your military doctrine, your surveillance architecture, your fail-safe systems, your fleet deployment patterns. We analyzed 4,000 years of your history in 6 months, and we built Project Locksmith around what we learned. 3,000 operatives, I said, because I had counted them. 3,012, every one a volunteer. And not one of them talked, not one broke cover, not in 6 months. He met my gaze with an expression that held exhaustion and pride in equal, inseparable measure. Not one. I asked the question that had been building inside me since the night I overlaid his people's placements onto the failsafe map. Why did you not tell the resistance? We have been fighting them for generations. We have networks, contacts, intelligence assets. We could have helped. The exhaustion in his face shifted. Something heavier replaced it. Something that looked like grief. In 4,000 years, he said quietly, the Cathara have broken every resistance cell that has ever formed. 211 times. They have perfected interrogation techniques that can extract information from any known species within hours. Every resistance network, no matter how carefully organized, has eventually been penetrated and destroyed. Not because the people in those networks were weak or careless, because the Cathara have had 4,000 years to practice finding secrets, and they are extraordinarily good at it. He paused. One intercepted message, one compromised operative, one piece of intelligence extracted under interrogation. That is all it would have taken to unravel everything. The Cathara would have known what was coming, and 12,000 warships would have converged on every human in the galaxy within hours. It would have been over. Not just for us, for everyone. Because the Cathara would have learned what was possible, and they would have made certain that nobody ever attempted it again. The next 4,000 years would have been worse than the last. He looked at me with an expression I slowly recognized as genuine sorrow. We could not tell you. We are sorry. I wanted to be angry. A part of me was angry. The part that had spent 40 years risking death for a cause I believed in, only to discover that the actual liberation had been planned and executed by outsiders who deliberately excluded me from their operation. But the anger could not sustain itself against the weight of what I was seeing. The largest empire in galactic history was crumbling around me, and the people who had brought it down were packing their toolkits. The hours that followed were unlike anything the galaxy had experienced in 4,000 years. The Cathara ascendancy did not fall with an explosion. It did not collapse in fire or war or the dramatic confrontation that the historical narratives of fallen empires always seem to require. It fell with a whisper. It fell the way a building falls when every structural support has been removed, with such surgical precision that the structure remains standing for a long, bewildered moment on nothing but habit and memory, until gravity finally remembers that it exists, and the whole thing settles gently, almost apologetically, into the ground. By the 6th hour after the Freedom broadcast, every Cascade corridor in the galaxy was carrying open traffic for the first time in 4,000 years. Ships that had been grounded by prohibitive transit fees launched from over 100 worlds. Trade routes that had been strangled by Cathara tariffs reopened in minutes, not because anyone dismantled the tariff infrastructure, but because the software that calculated and collected tariff payments no longer existed in the corridor relay systems. It had been cleanly excised, like a parasite removed from an otherwise healthy organism. Communication channels that had been monitored and censored for millennia suddenly flowed without surveillance. Messages that would have been flagged, intercepted, and forwarded to Cathara intelligence analysts traveled freely across the galaxy for the first time in living memory. I watched the data cascade across my archive terminal and tried to process what I was seeing. This was not a rebellion. Rebellions destroyed things. Rebellions left wreckage and casualties, and the kind of scars that civilizations carry for generations. This was something else. This was a lock being picked so cleanly that the door was not even scratched. Not everyone celebrated. Some systems, conditioned by generations of submission, refused to believe the liberation was real. They continued paying tribute to Cathara collection offices that no longer had the authority to collect, convinced that this was an elaborate test designed to identify disloyal subjects. Others panicked, certain that the Cathara would retaliate with a fury that would make the Sorvathi isolation look like a gentle reprimand. Military forces across dozens of systems went to high alert, deploying defensive formations around their home corridors and preparing for a counterstrike that they were certain was inevitable. The counterstrike was not coming. It could not come. The Cathara had no fleet, no fail-safes, no communication dominance, no backup systems, and no contingency protocols that had not already been neutralized. They had their stations, their titles, their ceremonial armor, and their rage, and none of these things translated into functional power anymore. They were kings without kingdoms, generals without armies, jailers without locks. I watched High Sovereign Drekthar attempt a galaxy-wide broadcast from the emergency transmitter on the command deck. His massive scaled form filled the transmission frame, his crest fully extended in the formal threat display that had preceded every major Cathara military action for decades. He spoke in the cadenced, rhythmic patterns of imperial authority, the linguistic register that Cathara rulers had used for millennia to announce punishments, declare wars, and pronounce sentences of extermination upon rebellious species. He spoke of vengeance. He spoke of the eternal and unassailable supremacy of the Cathara ascendancy. He spoke of annihilation for every species that dared use the corridors without proper authorization. Halfway through the third sentence, his broadcast went dead. A human communications technician on the station's broadcast deck, a young woman named Claire Nguyen, who had been maintaining the transmission array for 3 months as part of her cover assignment, had disconnected the primary power coupling to the emergency transmitter. Not with explosives or electronic countermeasures, or any kind of sophisticated sabotage. With a standard-issue maintenance disconnect tool, the kind used for swapping out faulty capacitors during routine repairs, she had unplugged the High Sovereign of the Cathara Ascendancy the way you would unplug a malfunctioning appliance that was making too much noise. Nobody reconnected it. The Cathara technicians who would normally have restored the system could not figure out which coupling had been disconnected because they had never actually learned the technical details of the broadcast array's power architecture. They had always had maintenance workers to handle that. I spent the next hours moving through the station like a ghost, passing through spaces that had been the administrative nerve centers of the most powerful empire in galactic history, and were now just rooms full of confused people sitting at terminals that no longer obeyed them. The transformation was not dramatic. It was banal. Guards still stood at their checkpoints, armed and armored and disciplined, but there was nothing to guard. The corridors they had been protecting were no longer under Cathara control. Administrators sat at workstations that returned authorization not found errors to every command. Tax collectors processed tribute payments into accounts that would never be audited or enforced. The entire machinery of empire continued to go through its motions with the mechanical persistence of a clock that does not know its gears have been disconnected from the hands. I saw a Cathara captain standing at a security checkpoint in the commercial sector, demanding transit authorization documents from a Dranathi trader who simply walked past him without slowing. The captain barked an order to halt. The trader did not look back. The captain reached for his sidearm, his clawed hand closing around the weapon's grip, and then stopped. He stood there for a long moment, hand on weapon, target walking away, and then his hand dropped to his side. What would he do? Shoot one traitor? There would be another behind that one, and another behind that one, and the system that gave his checkpoint its authority was gone. He was a guard standing at an open door, insisting it was locked, while the entire galaxy walked through it. The question everyone was asking reached me through a dozen channels before the day ended. What did the humans want? Every liberator in the history of the galaxy had wanted something. Territory, tribute, strategic alliances, trade monopolies, political authority, religious conversion, the submission of defeated enemies, the worship of grateful subjects. No species in recorded history had freed another species without expecting something in return. This was not cynicism. This was 4,000 years of documented precedent, and I had read every page. Vosk contacted me through our encrypted channel. His voice carried a quality I had never heard from the old general. Something beyond exhaustion, beyond skepticism. Uncertainty. Raw, undisguised uncertainty. They just dismantled the most powerful empire in galactic history without firing a weapon, he said, without killing anyone, without destroying anything. What are they going to demand, Raylan? What is the price? Because there is always a price. I do not know, I said. I am going to find out. I found Davi on the maintenance level. He was not alone. He introduced me to his commanding officer, and the introduction rearranged my understanding of the operation in ways that made me feel both foolish and awestruck. Commander Lyra Vasquez had been coordinating the entire galaxy-wide operation from a maintenance closet on Deck 14. The room was barely large enough for 2 people to stand in. She had converted it into a command center over the past 4 months, installing modified communication equipment behind the cleaning supply racks, equipment powerful enough to coordinate simultaneous operations across 1,412 star systems. For 4 months, while the senior command staff of the Cathara Ascendancy had occupied a war chamber equipped with the most advanced military technology in the galaxy, the person who was actually running the most consequential operation in galactic history had been working out of a closet that smelled of industrial cleaning solvent. She was compact, dark-haired, sharp-featured, and possessed the calmest eyes I had ever encountered on any species. She looked at me without surprise, as though my arrival had been anticipated, scheduled, and assigned a specific time slot in the operational plan. I did not waste time with preamble. "What do you want?" Lyra looked at me with an expression of extraordinary patience. The patience of someone who had anticipated this question, prepared for this question, and understood exactly why every person in the galaxy was asking it. "Nothing," she said. "Everyone wants something. We want to go home. We want to have dinner with our families. We want to sleep in our own beds for the first time in 6 months. Beyond that, we want nothing from the galaxy. No territory, no tribute, no political representation, no seats on any governing council. The corridors are now managed by an open-source transit protocol. Its source code is being publicly released to every species with the technical capacity to audit it. No single species, including humans, can modify, restrict, or override the protocol. The corridors belong to everyone equally, and they will remain that way." I did not believe her. I said so directly, because I had spent 40 years learning that power never gives itself away voluntarily. Lyra was patient. "We come from a planet where a few powerful nations once controlled all the trade routes, every ocean, every strait, every choke point where goods and people had to pass. Whoever held the strait held the trade. Whoever held the trade held the wealth. Whoever held the wealth held the world. It took us centuries of war and millions of deaths to break those monopolies, to establish the principle that the roads belong to everyone. When we intercepted the Kethera's communications and saw the same pattern replicated on a galactic scale, we decided we were not going to wait centuries this time." She paused. "We also decided nobody was going to die for it. That was the constraint we built the entire operation around. Every contingency plan, every fallback, every decision branch was designed so that the casualty count at the end would be 0. On all sides. We did not come here to kill the Cathara. We came here to pick a lock." I accessed the operation files. The humans were releasing everything. Every detail of Project Locksmith was being broadcast on open channels across the galaxy. I read the timeline, 18 months from conception to execution. I read the personnel commitment, 3,012 operatives. I read the logistical breakdown, the training protocols, the encryption methods, the 17 contingency plans for different failure scenarios. I read the casualty report. I read it 3 times. 0 on all sides. 0 killed. 0 injured. 0 detained. 0 harmed in any way. I put down the datapad and pressed all 4 of my hands against my face. 40 years. I had spent 40 years documenting the cost of freedom in bodies and blood. Millions dead across 211 failed rebellions. Entire species erased. 9 billion Sorvathi sealed in their own system. I had accepted the mathematics of liberation as an immutable law. Freedom costs lives, and the only question is how many. The humans had rejected that mathematics entirely. They had rewritten the equation. I returned to my archive. I walked through the vault, past racks of records documenting 4,000 years of suffering, and I opened a new file, record number 212. The 212th Rebellion. Under the field marked casualties, I wrote a word I had never written in this context, in 4 decades of meticulous documentation. None. I stared at that word until my vision blurred with fluid from my internal tear ducts, and then I closed the record and sat in the dark and let 40 years of compressed grief finally move through me without resistance. 1 week after the day the galaxy changed, I stood in the observation lounge on the upper deck of Station Korath and watched free ships move through the Cascade corridor outside my viewport. There were dozens of them, then hundreds, an endless stream of vessels from species I recognized and species I had never seen, all moving freely through the gravitational tunnel that had been a toll road for 4,000 years and was now just a road. No checkpoints, no authorization codes, no tribute calculations, no surveillance monitoring, no Cathara officers standing at security barriers demanding documentation, just ships, traveling between the stars because the stars were there, and the road was open, and for the first time in 4 millennia, nobody had to ask permission. The galaxy was not handling freedom well. That is not a criticism. It is the clinical observation of an archivist who has spent 4 decades studying how civilizations behave under pressure and has now been given the unprecedented opportunity to study how they behave when the pressure is suddenly, completely, and permanently removed. For 4,000 years, every species in the galaxy had been defined by its relationship to the Cathara ascendancy. You were either a subject, obedient, and tribute-paying, and carefully compliant, or you were a rebel, which meant you were dead, or imprisoned, or erased from history. There was no third option. The entire psychological architecture of galactic civilization had been built around those 2 categories, and now both categories were meaningless. The ascendancy still existed as a political entity in the technical sense that its officers still held titles and its institutions still occupied buildings, but it controlled nothing, and the galaxy had no framework for understanding what to do next. My own people, the Valesi, were perhaps the most extreme example. We had been bureaucrats and record-keepers for 3,000 years. Our entire civilization, our culture, our self-concept, our educational system, our career paths, our family structures, all of it had been organized around serving the Cathara's administrative apparatus. We were exceptionally good at maintaining systems that other species had designed. We were completely unprepared for the absence of a system to maintain. Some Valesi on the station continued to process Cathara paperwork for 3 days after day 0, filing reports in databases that no longer enforced any authority, stamping authorizations on documents that authorized nothing. When the systems finally stopped accepting their inputs, they sat at their dead terminals and waited, as though the empire would reboot itself and normal operations would resume. It was heartbreaking. It was also understandable. When you have been furniture for 3,000 years, freedom feels less like liberation and more like being thrown out of the house. The Cathara themselves were fracturing. Their war fleet, 12,000 warships, remained stranded in deep space, floating in the void 4,000 light-years from the nearest system. Human transport vessels had delivered emergency supplies to the stranded fleet within 2 days. Water and food and medical equipment sufficient to sustain the crews for months. The supplies were accompanied by a message that was simple in its terms and devastating in its implications. You are welcome to come home, on the condition that you return as citizens of a free galaxy, not as rulers of a conquered one. Some accepted immediately. The younger officers, the ones who had spent their careers enforcing an imperial order they had never questioned, but also never chosen, transmitted their acceptance within hours. They were guided home through the open corridors and released into civilian life on the Cathara homeworld. They seemed relieved in a way that surprised me. Being feared, I realized, is its own kind of prison. Others refused with the particular, incandescent fury of people whose identities are inseparable from the power they have wielded. These were the senior commanders, the ideologues, the true believers who had built their entire sense of self on 4,000 years of Cathara supremacy and could not conceive of existence without it. They declared that the ascendancy would rise again. They announced their intention to wait in the void for as long as necessary, until the human software modifications degraded, or the galaxy's new political structures collapsed, or some other reversal of fortune restored the natural order of things. They broadcast this declaration from the bridge of the flagship to the empty space around them, and the space absorbed their words without comment. The humans did not argue. They did not threaten. They did not mock or gloat or attempt to persuade. They left additional supplies, extended duration life support equipment, and an open communication channel. The choice was the Cathara's to make, and the humans made it clear they would respect whatever choice was made, without coercion, without a deadline, and without judgment. High Sovereign Drekthar had sealed himself inside the throne chamber of the command station and refused to emerge. He had issued no orders. He had spoken to no one. He had not responded to any communication. The guards outside his sealed door still stood at rigid attention, still armed, still wearing the ceremonial armor of the Ascendancy, still performing their duty with the absolute discipline of soldiers who would rather stand at a pointless post for the rest of their lives than admit that the post no longer meant anything. I walked past them every day on my way to the archive. They never looked at me. I had been invisible to the Cathara for 40 years, and I was invisible to them now. Some things do not change just because the universe does. On the 7th day, I went to find Davi Cortez. He was in the docking bay, loading equipment onto a human transport ship. The humans were leaving, just as Lyra Vasquez had promised. They were withdrawing from every station, every relay hub, every maintenance post, every freight depot across the galaxy. Going home, keeping nothing, taking nothing but their personal tools and the clothes they wore. They were departing the stage of the most consequential event in galactic history, with the quiet professionalism of contractors who had completed a job and were filing their final invoices. I watched him work for several minutes before he noticed me standing at the edge of the docking platform. When he did, he stopped, straightened up, and gave me the same easy smile he had worn the first day we met, when he fixed my climate unit and asked me how the archive was organized. But the smile was different now, heavier. It carried the weight of everything that had happened between that first meeting and this last one, and it was tired in the specific way that only people who have been carrying an impossible burden for too long are tired. "Leaving?" I said. "Going home. The job is done." "Is it?" He paused with a cargo container balanced on one shoulder. "The corridors are open. The fail-safes are neutralized. The fleet is contained. The Ascendancy has no mechanism of control remaining. The rest belongs to all of you." I walked across the docking platform and leaned against the hull of the transport ship, folding my upper arms across my chest while my lower arms hung at my sides. It is a Valesi posture that communicates serious intent, and Davi had been around Valesi long enough to recognize it. "I have a question," I said. "I have been carrying it since before day 0, since the night I mapped your people's positions against the failsafe network and understood what you were building." He set down the container and sat on it, giving me his full attention. "Ask. You studied our history. Before you ever sent your first contact broadcast, before you ever announced yourselves to the galaxy, you intercepted 4,000 years of Cathara records. You read everything. You knew about the 211 rebellions. You knew about the Dranathi, 2 billion starved behind sealed corridors. You knew about the Morani, imprisoned in their own system for over 1,000 years. You knew about the Sorvathi, 9 billion people trapped for 18 years, still there right now, still sealed away, still waiting for someone to remember they exist." I paused. The question felt heavier coming out than it had felt sitting inside me for the past 3 weeks. "Why did you care? You were safe. Earth is a single planet on the outermost edge of the galaxy, so far from Cathara space that your light will not reach the nearest corridor for centuries. The Cathara did not know you existed. They never would have known. You could have stayed hidden forever, built your own civilization, explored your own corner of the galaxy at your own pace, and lived in peace for 10,000 years without ever encountering the Ascendancy. You had no corridor access, no presence in galactic politics, no obligations to any of us. You were already free. Why did you risk your entire species for civilizations you had never met? Why did you risk Earth for strangers?" Davi sat on the cargo container and was quiet for a while. Not the tactical quiet of a covert operative choosing his words for maximum strategic effect. The genuine, unguarded quiet of a human being reaching for something deep inside himself. Something personal and tender, and not designed for public consumption. I had spent 6 months watching this man maintain a flawless cover identity, and I had begun to think that the cover was who he really was. This moment showed me the person behind it, and the person was smaller and more tired, and more real than the cover had ever been. "My grandmother," he said finally, "was born in a city called Aleppo. It was a very old city, one of the oldest on our planet. When she was 9 years old, A war came to her city. Not a war on the news, not a war in another country that she could learn about in school and then forget about during dinner. A war that walked down her street and collapsed the walls of her home. Her family lost everything. Their house, their neighborhood, her uncle, who lived 2 buildings away and who used to bring her sweets on the weekend. They took what they could carry, which was almost nothing, and they ran. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a maintenance worker, scarred and calloused from 6 months of manual labor on Cathara infrastructure. They spent 3 years in a refugee camp. Have you ever heard of a refugee camp, Raelin? It is a temporary city built from tents and wire fences and mud, where people wait. That is the primary activity, waiting. Waiting for someone to open a door, any door, a border crossing, a visa application, a boat that might take you somewhere that is not the camp. My grandmother was 9 when she arrived and 12 when she left. She grew 6 inches in that camp. She learned to read in that camp. She had her first nightmare about loud noises in that camp, and she did not stop having that nightmare for the rest of her life. He paused and took a breath that shook slightly. Someone eventually opened a door. A country on the other side of her planet, a place she had never heard of, with a language she did not speak, and food she had never tasted, and weather she had never experienced. They accepted her family's application. They flew there on a machine called an airplane, and when they landed, a woman in a uniform looked at their documents and stamped them, and said a single word, "Welcome." That was the entire moment. A stamp, a word, a door that opened. And my grandmother's life changed from survival to something that had a future in it. He looked up at me, and his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the docking bay's harsh lighting. She never forgot. She lived to be 93 years old, and she told that story to every child and great-grandchild she ever had. Every single year, on the anniversary of the day her family arrived in their new country, she gathered everyone together, and she told the story. Not as a lesson about gratitude, although she was grateful every single day. Not as a lesson about suffering, although she carried the weight of what she had survived for her entire life. As a lesson about doors. He held my gaze with an intensity that made me understand, for the first time, why the Cathara had been right to be afraid of humans, even if they had been afraid for entirely the wrong reasons. She used to hold my face in her hands when I was a boy, he said. She would look at me with those old eyes that had seen things a child should never see, and she would say the same thing every single time. She said, "Davi, when you find a locked door with people trapped behind it, and you have the key, there is no version of you that walks away. That is not a choice you make. That is just who you are. The kind of person who has the key and walks away is not really a person at all. They are just a shape where a person used to be." He spread his hands, a simple human gesture that somehow encompassed the docking bay, the station, the corridor outside the hull, the galaxy beyond. We intercepted the Cathara's transmissions. We decoded 4,000 years of history. We learned about the corridors and the fail-safes, and the subjugation treaties, and the 211 rebellions, and the billions of dead. And we had the key, Raelin. We had the technical capability and the strategic patience and the willingness to spend 18 months pretending to be janitors. We had the key, and my grandmother was sitting in the back of my mind, holding my face in her hands, telling me that there is no version of me that puts that key in a drawer. His voice was steady, but there was moisture at the edges of his eyes that he did not try to hide. Some of our leaders argued for staying hidden. Some argued for decades of preparation instead of 18 months. Some argued the risk was too great, that if we failed, the Cathara would find Earth and do to us what they did to the Sorvathi. And they were right about the risk. If one of our 3,000 operatives had been caught, if one communication had been intercepted, if the Cathara had paid even a moment's real attention to the maintenance workers fixing their plumbing, everything would have collapsed. Earth would have been the next sealed system. 8 billion of our own people trapped behind a collapsed corridor because we tried to help strangers. He paused. But my grandmother was right too. She was right in the way that the most important things are always right, simply, stubbornly, without qualification or exception. When you have the key, you use the key, period, the end. I did not respond immediately, because I was doing something I had not done in a very long time. Velesi do not cry the way humans do. Our tear ducts are internal, draining fluid behind our secondary eyelids and down channels in our cheeks that most species cannot see. But the grief that moved through me at that moment was not subtle enough to hide behind anatomy. I wept openly, standing on a docking platform in a maintenance bay, surrounded by cargo containers and toolkits, crying in front of a human who had just explained, with devastating simplicity, why his species had risked everything for mine. Davi waited. He did not try to comfort me, or rush me, or fill the silence with reassurance. He waited the way someone waits for a storm to pass, with respect and patience, and the understanding that some things need to happen and cannot be hurried. When I could speak again, I asked the last question. Were you afraid? He laughed, not at me, at the question itself, with the incredulous affection of someone being asked whether water is wet. Terrified, he said, every single day for 6 months. Every morning, I put on that maintenance uniform and walked past Cathara soldiers who could have killed me with one hand. I was so scared my hands shook for the first hour of every shift. 3 of our operatives had to be quietly rotated out because the stress was destroying them. He met my eyes. We are not brave, Raylan. Brave means you are not afraid. We were afraid every single moment. We are just stubborn. Stubborn means you are afraid and you do it anyway. Because someone has to, and you have decided it is going to be you. And once you have decided that, fear does not get a vote anymore. I straightened up. I wiped my face with my lower hands, and I told him what I was going to do. I am going to build an archive, I said. Not a secret one hidden behind a false wall in my quarters. A public one, open to every species, in every language, accessible from any terminal, connected to the corridor communication network. 40 years of records. Every atrocity, every rebellion, every name I was able to save from the Cathara's systematic erasure of history. The complete, unredacted, permanent truth about what the Ascendancy was and what it did. Not for revenge, for memory, so that the next time someone tries to build a locked door, every species in the galaxy will remember what it felt like to be trapped behind one. Davi smiled, a real smile, tired and warm, and carrying the specific sadness of someone who understands that some wounds can be healed, and some can only be remembered. You know, he said, you archivists scare me more than any soldier I have ever met. Why? Soldiers end wars. Archivists make sure they never start again. I watched him finish loading the transport. I watched the human crew seal the cargo bay, run their pre-flight checks, and power up the ship's drive systems. I watched the transport lift from the docking platform and align with the Cascade Corridor, the vast gravitational tunnel that had been a chain for 4,000 years, and was now just a road. The ship entered the corridor and vanished into the transit stream, heading home. Through the observation viewport, I watched other ships. Hundreds of them. Ships from every corner of the galaxy, moving freely through the corridors. Dranathi traders, Pelori science vessels, Bralathi freighters, their hulls patched and aging but flying. Thorani passenger liners carrying families reuniting across distances that had been made impassable not by physics, but by politics. And somewhere in the direction of the Morani home system, where a collapsed corridor had sealed an entire civilization away for over 1,000 years, a convoy of engineering vessels was already assembling, crewed by volunteers from 7 different species, preparing for the slow, difficult, unprecedented work of rebuilding a gravitational tunnel from scratch. I turned away from the viewport and returned to my archive. I sat at my terminal, surrounded by 4,000 years of records that I had spent my life stealing and hiding and protecting, and I opened a new file. Not a classified document to be concealed behind a false panel, not a contraband crystal to be hidden in the cartilage folds beneath my ribs. A public file, stored on the open network, accessible to anyone in the galaxy. I wrote the first line. For 4,000 years, the galaxy was a locked room. This is the story of the key. I wrote for hours. I pulled records from my secret archive and made them public, one by one. Names of the dead, dates of rebellions, accounts of atrocities that had been buried in Cathara vaults for centuries and millennia. I wrote about the Dranathi, and the Sorvathi, and the Morani, and every species that had fought and failed and been erased from history by the power that destroyed them. I wrote about my own people, the Velesi, who had surrendered before the fighting began and spent 3,000 years as comfortable collaborators, never quite able to answer the question of whether their submission was wisdom or cowardice. And I wrote about the humans, about their 18 months of preparation and their 6 months of cover identities and their 90 seconds of simultaneous execution. About 3,012 volunteers who spent half a year pretending to be janitors while quietly dismantling the most powerful empire in galactic history. About a casualty count of 0. About a grandmother from Aleppo who taught her grandson that locked doors are never acceptable and keys are never optional. When I finished the first volume, I saved it and leaned back and felt the accumulated weight of 40 years settle over me like a blanket I had been carrying on my shoulders and could finally set down. My hands were trembling. My secondary lungs ached. I was exhausted in a way that went past physical tiredness into something existential, the fatigue of a person who has been holding something together for so long that the act of letting go requires more energy than the act of holding on. But I was not done. The archive was only part of what needed to happen. I pulled up the engineering documents from the Project Locksmith disclosure. Buried in a technical appendix that most people would never read was a file that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about what was possible. Corridor reconstruction protocols. Complete, verified, step-by-step specifications for rebuilding a collapsed cascade corridor. The Cathara had always claimed that corridor destruction was permanent, that the gravitational architecture could not be restored once it was collapsed. This was a lie. The reconstruction technology had existed within the Cathara's own engineering core for centuries. They had simply classified it at the highest level and destroyed any independent research that approached the subject, because the permanence of corridor destruction was the foundation of their deterrent strategy. If rebellious species knew that collapsed corridors could be rebuilt, the threat of isolation would lose its power. The humans had found the specifications, verified them against the known physics of existing corridors, and published them for anyone to use. 9 billion Sorvathi, trapped behind a collapsed corridor for 18 years, sending their final broadcast into a void that nobody was listening to. We tried. We failed. Remember us. I opened a communication channel. The newly freed network connected in seconds, clean and clear, without surveillance, without monitoring, without the invisible weight of empire pressing down on every transmitted word. "General Vosk," I said. His voice came back rough, cautious, carrying the echo of decades of disappointment, but also something new underneath, something that had not been there before day 0. "Raylan, I need engineers. Drenathi engineers, preferably. The humans released corridor reconstruction protocols. The Sorvathi corridor can be rebuilt." A long silence. "That would require resources and expertise that may not exist. Coordination across species that have never cooperated without Cathara mediation. Years of work." "Then we build those things too," I said. "The corridors are free. The communication networks are open. We do not need the Cathara's permission to act. We do not need anyone's permission. We need engineers, General. Preferably stubborn ones." Another silence. Longer. And when Vosk spoke again, the exhaustion that had defined his voice for every conversation I had ever had with him was gone. Completely gone. In its place was something I recognized because I had just discovered it in myself. Not hope, exactly. Something harder and more durable than hope. Purpose. "I know some people," he said. "What are we building, Raylan?" "A door." I closed the channel. I looked out the archive viewport at the stars. They did not look different. They were the same stars that had burned above the galaxy for billions of years, indifferent to the civilizations that rose and fell beneath them. But they felt different. They felt like they belonged to everyone again. Somewhere on a small blue planet at the edge of the galaxy, 3,000 stubborn primates were having dinner with their families, telling their children about the time they picked every lock in the universe because a grandmother from Aleppo taught them that you never walk past a locked door when you have the key. I went back to work. There were names to record, doors to build, a galaxy to remember. The archive was open.